much, Justin. It's nice to come along again. Yeah, a couple of months ago, Justin asked me to what I could present on, and I do various weird things in my spare time. I'm an IT person by trade, and I do things off the side of my desk to keep myself sane. And he said, "What do you got ready? What could you present on?" And I thought, there's things that are half built. In fact, a lot of things that are half built. And there's this one that occurred to me was, well, I've been doing VR for a little while now, and it's just gone a million miles in not that many years. We could do archaeology, because you could actually go, and what I'll talk about today is this hardware here, which represents about, let's go with 8 or 9 years of development, which seems like not very long, but is just a quantum leap in terms of difference. But if you're doing VR as an idea has been around for a while, so I thought I'll do the talk on VR generally, where it came from. It had a little time in the sun in the 80s and 90s, we'll talk about that, and then we'll talk to the lead up to this stuff. It looks worse than it is. I only have one computer. I never run this stuff with, I only ever run one rig at a time, so thank you to Ron for donating some computers that I could, well, they'll be okay. Jury rigged some graphics cards too, so that we could run them all together. So yeah, let's have a go. And in the spirit of motion sickness, I'm using Prezi, which will probably give you motion sickness. In terms of demos, the one that's closest to me is the oldest. I would encourage you, if you're going to have a go, pick up the headset, pick up the controller, start on this one, then to the one on the other side of the table, and then to the one at the end there. So you're going from the oldest to the middle to the newest. They're running the same demonstration, doing pretty much exactly the same thing, and that's quite deliberate, really difficult to achieve, because the old demos don't want to run on the new gear, but that's just an aside. But that's the best way to actually see what's improved, what's changed. There are other demos, so if everybody's satisfied and happy at the end of it and we've got through it, and you want to see something else, just come and talk to me, and the one at the end can do other things. Now, I did say try sitting first, but I have changed my mind. If you are a little bit worried about motion sickness, do just grab a seat and pull that up, and 2 of them have cameras. Make the camera roughly point towards you and you'll be fine. Alright, so we're going to go way back. This is a quote from a guy that I quite like. This is one from Ian Salomon. He's making a case for like graphics not just being the screen, but being something immersive. And the year he said it was amazing. This is 1965. That's pre 99% of computer graphics. What existed was research. This guy's thesis was a CAD program called Sketchpad. If you find yourself on YouTube, type in Sketchpad 1963, and you'll see a demonstration that this guy did that was so far in front of its time. It's just amazing. And he was the grandfather of object-oriented programming and all sorts of really cool nerd things. Very much Aladdin ahead of his time. And he'd seen simulation, and I tried to do this VR archaeology, and I did a little bit of research. Okay, what's the origin story? And you'll see me looking at a lot of notes. I have a huge amount of them. And putting an origin on simulation is really hard, because what do you mean by simulation, right? So you had Babbage in the 1800s. He had a different engine that was about simulating trajectories. Don't really mean that. You had a guy called Edwin Link in the 20s making mechanical simulators for aviation. Link trainers, they were called, were used all the way through World War II by every major power to train their pilots. Certainly, it's a type of VR, isn't it? If you want to stretch it, you can go back into like ancient past, Antikythera mechanisms that were predicting, right, simulating moonrises and all sorts of fun stuff. But that's getting a bit, that's getting a little bit breathless. So tighten up the definition a bit. Let's go, okay, let's say it's got a non-persistent display. It's got some sort of a screen. In that case, you're talking about post-war. And there were missile simulation games for arcades, and I will get into arcades. There's quite a bit of VR actually came from that world. There were missile simulation games as an amusement in 1948, which is cool, but they were not really computer. They were still quite mechanical, even though they had a screen. Then you had emerging games in the 50s, things like Tennis for Two. Great, still a virtual world, isn't it? Not really what I've got as my origin point, because that was analog. But Sutherland just about hit it. He'd seen a lot of this stuff, and there was also a thing called Sensorama in the 50s, which was like an idea of a quite mad inventor to have an immersive cinema, and you stuck your face up against it and it would show you a stereoscopic image and you'd be able to be somewhat immersed, but you couldn't interact with that world in any way. It was just a static, we're going to show you pictures like those old kid vision things that you'd see the slides of. But Ivan Sutherland was a weird bloke, and he, after he did his thesis, he went into University of Utah and he built this, which is the Sword of Damocles. And it's 100 and something kilograms of angle sensors and CRTs and optical guides tethered to the victim's head, hanging. It was called the Sword of Damocles because it was hanging above you, and this quite giant rig was, I don't know, just held by a hair from a horse's tail, I suppose. And that was in 1966. But he had 2.5 degrees of freedom. You could move around and you could look, and you had very, very basic computer graphics. And as a research project, it was a really great articulation of the problems that you have to address if you're going to do VR, if you're actually going to try to do it. You need stereo graphics. You need to know, two separated views. You need to know where the participant's head is in space, or at least which way it's oriented, which way you're looking up, looking sideways. Ultimately, that's actually a 6 degree of freedom problem rather than 3 degrees of freedom, because you can move side to side and back and up and down. That's 2 and a bit degrees of freedom. So he done as well as you could do in the day. Also, the displays were not good, but that doesn't really matter because 3D graphics hadn't been invented. And I'll leave Sutherland here. He's a little bit of an idol of mine, and his impressive headgear, but he went on to the University of Utah, and one of the good things about doing a presentation like this, it forces you to do a degree of research to kind of glue some kind of narrative around things. And a lot of names just pop up through computing history, and they pop up through graphics history, which is kind of my interest. And they all went to bloody University of Utah. And I didn't actually realise this until quite recently. So in the University of Utah, this guy and Dave Evans, between them, bump mapping, Gouraud shading, hidden surface determination, every 3D graphic primitive that there is, and the first standards for 3D graphics, all emerged from the University of Utah in the 70s, which just boggles the mind. And I did grab some names, just of people that this guy taught. You've got Edwin Catmull, who founded Pixar, and he's now the CEO of Disney. You've got John Warnock, who founded Adobe, which is a fairly big deal in graphics. Jim Clark founded Silicon Graphics. Henry Gouraud of the shading, Jim Blin and Bu Fong of Blin Fong Shading, which is a cheap way of getting highlights on textures in 3D space. And a guy called Martin Newell. Martin Newell, after the University of Utah, went to work for Xerox PARC and built a really nice little graphics machine running object-oriented code, which was ripped off by Steve Jobs and became basically the Apple Mac as we understand it. It was straight lineage back to the University of Utah, which just, to me, is just amazing. So lots of people at UU did cool stuff, and some standards, like there's a standard out there called OpenGL. You can trace OpenGL all the way back to 1974. It's the same document, and it has gone through a couple of different names over the time. Just amazing. But VR boom. I chose this because, well, it appealed to me. So those guys went into the industry and they developed algorithms. They also were developing hardware and silicon for what? Well, they were developing it for military, but they were also kind of got co-opted into the amusement industry. And that morphed into the video game industry in the late 70s and 80s. And Atari made insane money making early consoles. And the technological change was being driven by the hunt for novelty. You get people into your arcade by doing novel and cool things. And that was a bigger market than the military simulators. And graphics kind of went in that direction. In 81, Atari hired a bunch of people into what we'd call a virtual reality division. And it wasn't called that then, it hadn't been coined as a term. But between 78 and 82, Atari invented a whole bunch of stuff that you use in VR now. They invented force feedback, vector-driven graphics, which I'll talk about later. That came from there, and just basic stuff, building a cockpit around the person that's playing the game to give a sense of immersion. That all came from there. And the arse fell out of the arcade industry in the 83, and Atari had time to drop one really good and really influential game that kind of started it. I don't know who's seen this or who's had the chance to play it. You play it online, it's great. This is Star Wars. Didn't start life as Star Wars, it started life as something else, but they knew what they were making. And its development started in 81. It's wholly vector driven, so on the CRT it's got more in common with a cathode ray oscilloscope rather than a TV screen. It actually drives the electron beam to draw the shapes. When you're doing that, you don't need as much RAM, and you can start to do clever things with perspective. Also, what was interesting here is it actually was real 3D space, so the things that were further away it was representing as further away. It wasn't being done with two-dimensional tricks. Yeah, I'm just hoping that I've got my slides more or less sorted. Yes, I've missed a page. Alright, so I'm going to try to move along. And just snapshot in time, like people at that time had a very good idea of, what they needed to achieve any kind of virtual reality. It's just they didn't really have the hardware. So that Atari is 6809. It's, as I say, it's a CRT. One of the fun things again about doing these talks is you have to go and find slides. I have here, for those of a certain age and bent, like I started my career fixing old television, so I kind of like that world. That's the service manual here of that Star Wars game. Some beautiful person on the internet has found it, preserved it, all 200 pages of every component in it, every mechanical drawing out of it. Just stunning. And it was what you call a cockpit simulator. There were stand-up versions of it. You know how real cars never look as good as the concept drawings? This is the concept drawing of the cabin. It looked way better than the actual thing, so I used it. But it looked roughly like that. It wrapped around, and it actually started to cut off the outside world from you. And it's one of the only ways a cockpit simulator works, is if you can put blinkers on the victim that's inside it. But you get to 85, the gaming market's kind of split into two camps. You've got most of the market, which is like, think games like Space Invaders, Galaga, they're raster-based games, so it's just all 2D, it's moving sprites around a screen, and any 3D tricks, for example scaling sprites, making them look bigger, that kind of thing, that's all trickery. And then you've got this little corner of the market that is vector driven and 3D, and it's tiny. Not just in arcades, there was a thing called BBC Micro, and there was a game called Elite Dangerous that was available on the BBC Micro, and probably a handful of others that were again was drawing 3D. It was representing the world in perspective, which is the trick with VR. VR as a term gets coined in the 80s, about 87, by a guy called Jared Lanier. And look, it had a cultural peak way in front of the hardware. So that's a terrible thing that NASA put together. That was basically, you know, it's very similar to the Rift that you'll see here, except it didn't have a decent computer at the back of it to drive it. But also during that cultural peak, you had movies like Tron and Brainstorm. You had books like Neuromancer by William Gibson. This idea of you get immersed into a digital world. They kind of didn't exist until roughly the 80s, at least in a way that we'd understand it now. And then there's that kind of period from Neuromancer coming out in about 84 to maybe The Lawnmower Man in about 92. And it was a huge peak. Like, VR was a thing. It was a term that was widely understood. People knew what it was. It had a great deal of potential. It never actually went anywhere. And through the 90s, it had actually really significant investment. Huge amounts of money were dropped by people. And I've got slides start to speed up now. That's a thing called the Virtual Boy. This is peak VR optimism in about 95. It's fairly dreadful, but it's significant because it's true stereoscopic, albeit monochrome red. The business end of it is there, and that's the world if you, I don't know, 12 years old in 1995 and was silly enough or rich enough to have one of these bought for you. But the display is 300 by 200 pixels per eye and 4 degrees of shade, so it's not much more than a gimmick. But Nintendo was dropping a certain amount of money. Sega was dropping really, really serious amounts of money. That's an arcade cabinet that they dropped in 92, but not in any numbers until a little bit later. That's 2 axes, so you can move within 360 degrees. You can be suspended upside down. It was the couple of games they built for it. It was basically a cockpit simulator. Pretty cool. And not bad from a VR point of view, because your inner ear agrees with what's happening more or less. And for the consumer market, that came out. So VR's not that new, that's 95, and that again looks pretty familiar, but it's limited by the tech of the day. So you've got 260 by 230 pixels, capable of 256 colours, so that's not very good. The software's written for it custom. So every application has to solve the problems of 3D again and again and again. And that sort of herein lies the rub, right? It was all complicated, it was all difficult, and every one of these devices was a commercial failure for the company that brought them up. And they all had pretty big research budgets attached to it. But, you know, why was it commercial failure? Well, the hardware wasn't precise enough, the software was specialised and not very good. The computing hardware was not very good. I lived through 80s and 90s computing hardware, and it felt great at the time, it wasn't. And everything was expensive.
All in the eye of the beholder.
Yeah, it depends what you're doing with it, right? Accounting on a Commodore 64 is fantastic. 3D on a Commodore 64 is not going to happen. But these false starts are kind of important because it sets you up with the recipe of VR. So what do you actually need to do good virtual reality? You need a general purpose simulation engine. And I put game engines there because that's what gave it to us. You need 3D hardware. It's not just about general purpose computing. You need to be able to do 3D computing. I'll talk about that in a bit. You've got a need for lots of threads, lots of parallel things are going on. From the most basic, just think about you've got 2 separate views that you're computing. Those 2 3D visions that are presented on the goggles there are separated. So every piece of math that you have to do it twice. But it's way more multi-headed a problem than that. You also need some other things. You need really good sensors that can resolve where the person that's wearing the display is, because if you don't know which way it's facing, you don't know which way how that person is oriented in the virtual world. That's called pose estimation. And you need good audio. It's a weird thing, but that's actually a relatively recent invention. Quake was the first game that had really good positional audio. It could put a sound source anywhere the developer wanted and have it be convincing for the person that was using it. You also need cheap screens. And I'll talk about it later, but you need computer vision libraries. That's a whole new world. And you kind of needed applications that could be taught to do VR without having to be written from scratch. So, games. There you go, that's what you need. So, first of those things. When I say game engines, I mean game engines. This is Quake 3 Arena, but it's basically the first of the Quake engines. You'll notice there's a bit going on. Everything is nicely 3D. You've got very convincing perspective. You've got highlighting, specular highlighting, which is convincing because it gives you a very good sense of the origin of a light source. Now, the beauty of a game engine, if you imagine back to Toy Story was a movie that was 3D, they were ray traced, so you design the virtual world and then you have the software process essentially imaginary rays going out from the camera into this virtual world. It's incredibly time consuming. What a game engine has to do is all of that by cheating, because it has to do it in real time. It has to pump out 30 frames a second. And that's what these guys do. It was pioneered by games like Doom and Quake, that were written by the same people that kind of changed the world a bit. Now, Doom was released, I should know this off the top of my head, but early 90s, and it was largely written by a bloke called John Carmack. They were followed by other programmers that did other 3D engines that became the game engines that every game that you play, if you play a computer game, will have an origin in the 90s. People like Michael Abrash, Tim Sweeney, Ken Silverman, your game historians love these guys because they did just amazing things. There's potted histories. There's a book called The Merchants of Doom if you want to know about what these guys were doing in the 90s and what they actually delivered. Well worth a read. Suffice it to say that this game engine is actually directly related to the game engines that you've got here. They actually share common code base, common features. So that emerged about 2001, 2002 in a reasonable and convincing way, but you need good hardware. That's dedicated 3D board. The first, I would say, good dedicated 3D boards are Voodoo 2 from about, whatever I said that it was, late 90s, let's go late 90s. And the bottom, you've got something that's a bit more current. It's a Voodoo 2? No, not a Voodoo 2, sorry. That's a, something. ATI, that's right. ATI Radeon 7. So that's, bottom one is current. Just as they're about the biggest in terms of transistor count on a chip. They are the biggest chips that you can get. It's about 13 billion transistors on the thing underneath. Absolutely preposterous amount of computing power. Even like an i7, that's that big white computer, I think they're about...
Can you just explain what they are? I mean, are they a bit of silicon at the bottom? Or?
Sorry?
I think they're fans. No,
They
fans.
produce, when you've got 13 billion transistors, you've got quite a lot of waste heat. But essentially, that one there is just one chip with heat pipes to spread the heat. They burn about 100 watts. Some of the newer stuff can burn approaching 200 watts. And their job is to do all of the 3D calculations for your scene. They can be taught to do other tricks, which I won't go into, but for now, if you imagine you're reducing a 3D description of a scene into triangles, and you have to move every triangle in space, and a 3D scene now will have millions of triangles that you're recalculating not less than 60 times a second. The mathematical overhead is insane. You also have large chunks of RAM because it's not just triangles, there's textures, there's colours, there's lights. They all exist in RAM that's adjacent to those boards. Now, I understand that this is not necessarily a gaming crowd, so I just thought I'd grab a show reel of one of the more modern game engines and hope to God that the thing works. So if you... These are all 3D scenes being rendered in real time, so it's not off to a ray tracing farm and come back in 3 days. This is live. This engine's Crytek. There's only about sort of 4 engines that are seriously able to get to almost photorealistic 3-dimensional renderings. Now, if you imagine all of these are reduced to like a wireframe description of the world, if a bog standard game engine can do this, and you tell it, don't take one point of view, take 2. So if you imagine there's always an imaginary camera in a game engine, and this is showing the view through one imaginary camera. Well, if you take 2 imaginary cameras separated by 62 millimeters, which is the interpupil distance, and give it a field of view of roughly 135 degrees by 100 degrees, which is the human eye's field of view, you're actually in a place where you can generate proper stereo vision. And if you've got lots of processing power to essentially do all of that mathematics twice, it can kind of work. You've actually got a gaming engine. You've got a gaming engine that's capable of doing VR. It means that your developers that go and develop a game don't have to worry about, oh, do I have to do all of the hard problems for VR, or could I just use the tools of the trade? And they are the tools of the trade for the gaming industry now. And they support VR out the box. So that's, remember we talked about the recipe of what you need for VR. The other thing is you need to sense the HMD. That is that display at the end, the Rift at the end, under an infrared camera. Because humans move, and that's a 6-degree of freedom problem. So left, right, up, down, and pitch and yaw. The way that we do it is we point an infrared camera back at the sensor. Oh, sorry, we point an infrared camera back at the headset, and with really good computer vision libraries, they can pick out the points. And if I know the 3-dimensional shape of the device, it's called the constellation, my computer vision library can do that. Okay, I'm just looking at a picture, I'm looking for the dots in my infrared picture. Okay, I know that the dots are there, I know that they're this far apart, I can work my way back in the game engine and say, okay, this pose must be here, pointing up, pointing down, and I have to do it pretty quickly. I'll get to that. I've skipped a little bit fast, a little bit quickly. So I might just skip back. My apologies. That's part of the picture. That comes off those sensors about 60 times a second. But there's problems of occlusion if I move my hand in front of the face, if I move out of view of the camera. The other thing is 60 frames a second is not quick enough. So if you want people to get motion sick, put them in VR and delay things a little bit. So I move and then the picture slews around after me. The threshold is about 30 milliseconds. One frame of 30 frames a second, one frame is 33 milliseconds. So you're trying to do things really, really quickly. So what they have, those sensors on board, there's an accelerometer and a gyro and a magnetometer on all of those devices that are giving a much more rapid picture of the world, but just in terms of pitch and yaw of the headset, running at about 1,000 hertz. So 1,000 times a second is going, okay, I know where the camera thinks things are, and I know where the sensor thinks things are. I'll do, they call it sensor fusion in the documentation. It's actually black magic. It's basically at any point in time, the driver of the device is telling the game engine, this is where I think the headset is. And it's got to the point now in the last couple of years where those early devices, you pointed it somewhere and that's where the image went. That was not good enough because you have latency of display. You need the display to display what you're looking at now, not what you were looking at 20 milliseconds ago. So it actually guesses if I start to move my head, and the human head can move at about 360 degrees a second, it'll say, right, well, my trajectory is this, I'm going in this direction, I think I will dead reckon where this headset will be. which is just extraordinary, and it will do that absolute minimum 60 times a second. The stuff that's coming out now will do it 90 times a second, and that's a big part of getting rid of motion sickness. And once you've got that, you can do pose estimation, and that's all about which way I'm looking. And the magic number is 22 milliseconds. I have to do pose estimation within 22 milliseconds of you moving. Otherwise, if you're prone to motion sickness, you'll suffer it, and if you're not, you'll just feel laggy. So 22 milliseconds is it's literally blink of an eye. It's a ridiculously short amount of time, and it's a diabolically difficult problem to solve well. So that brings us kind of up to 2012, right? So we can kind of get into the hardware archaeology. I hope that's a potted history of the origin, so I hope that sort of covered it. These devices don't exist without the phone industry, particularly the phone industry mobile phone industry from about 2006 to 2010. And in fact, I'll get to it later, but the second Rift is a Samsung screen out of a Samsung phone, complete with Samsung badging. You need really good screens with really high pixel counts. The development kit one kind of brought the second boom of VR. If the 90s was the first boom, there was a bit of a winter. That was a Kickstarter in 2012, and he made a lot of money in that Kickstarter. A lot of people were interested in it because he was offering a headset for $300. You could get headsets in the mid-2000s that did a similar thing, but you couldn't get one for less than $3,000. So, order of magnitude drop in price. People came in their droves. It was also backed by John Carmack, who had a lot to do with early game engines, and he had a following that he could bring with it. Talking about specs, that's a 1200 by 800 screen that is shared between the two eyes. There's a little plastic divider between the two. So you get 640 by 800 per eye. Pretty basic. It also doesn't have any fancy tracking that I mentioned earlier. It's just got the accelerometers on board, so it can tell you which way it's pitching, but not where it is moving. So if you do try that one, maybe walk up to a balustrade and then move yourself around, you'll find that your point of view doesn't change when you sway left and right, only when you move your head around. Wasn't sold as a retail thing. This is a technical group, so I'm not going to show you anything that's not pulled to bits. That's DK2 over there. Now, DK2 came out 2 years later, actually probably closer to 18 months later. All of these shots are courtesy of iFixit. If you want to see any piece of consumer electronics pulled apart, iFixit are fantastic. A lot less of my things are broken because I don't have to see how they're put together now. So this guy's I'll talk about per eye resolution rather than the total resolution because that's what matters. It's 960 by 1080 pixels per eye. The first one's like looking through a screen door. The second one, like looking through a better quality screen door. The important thing is the refresh rate's getting better, 60 Hertz. The refresh rate on the second one's 75 Hertz. It's got a 100-degree field of view, which is okay. And it's got better rotation sensing, so that's where you get into 1,000 times a second sampling, and it's got the camera that's facing back. So similarly, that device on the other side there, it has a constellation of LEDs that it can dead reckon about. So if you grab that one and you move side to side, you'll find that your point of view moves side to side, so long as the camera can see you. And I loved that shot. It was a Samsung Note, and they just took the whole screen assembly and whacked it into their pre-production hardware. Hole for the speaker and everything. Alright, consumer version 1, which is that one there. All of these by a company called Oculus. There's another company, HTC, that make mobile phones. They're the other big player in this, but there's also some smaller ones. They do things a bit differently, but they're comparable. So this guy came out in 2016. So I said, yeah, okay, that's believable. First thing you'll notice, 2 screens. Different people with, depending on how your eyes age as you get older, they're all adjustable. When you've got 2 screens, you can adjust them independently. So if you have slightly different focal characteristics on your eyes, you can actually relieve it, which is nice. It's a better screen. It's 2,560 by 1,440 per eye, so that's quite a lot of pixels. 115 degrees, so slightly better field of view. It's now been replaced. The next one is about a 20% improvement in pixels, and they flip the tracking around. So whereas that's got a camera that points back, the vision libraries have got so much better. The new headsets have 6 or 7 cameras in them that point out at the real world, and they'll pick objects, for example the coffee table, anything that's got an edge pretty much, and go, okay, I've got edges there, edges there, edges there, and because I've got at least 2 cameras looking at the outside world at any given moment, I can triangulate based on those edges that I can detect. Preposterous amount of processing is needed to do that, but we have that at our disposal now. The latest version of the Rift is really good because now it knows, they've got tricks that they've added into the drivers, now it knows where the coffee table is. It can tell you before you walk into it, and it does. Also, if somebody walks into the room behind you, because again it's got this suite of cameras, it helpfully tells you when you are completely immersed, hey, someone's just walked in, you might want to know, thanks very much. Nice things, but telling you about the coffee table that you're about to walk into or any other fixed object, having played around with this gear for a couple of years, brilliant. So this represents the last change, and really the major change that's been released in the last year is they've said, okay, our computer vision libraries are so good we can roughly construct the 3D environment that you're in and then sample it at approaching 100 frames a second. And we're not talking 10 centimetres of resolution, we're talking 0.5 millimetre of resolution. I know where the corner of that desk 3 metres away from me is. Cameras are that good and the processing is that fast. Just to me, that's just insane. The next trick, all of these are tethered devices. You've got a problem there, which is if you want to walk around in any of those virtual worlds, you have to pick up that controller, you have to push the stick forward. As soon as you do that, those that have already tried, your inner ear is going to go, this is not right. This doesn't work. It takes about 10 minutes for most people and it goes away. But if you want a really good virtual experience, you have to have what they call free roam. So you need a nice, unobtrusive space, and you need this kind of hardware that you can't even secretly buy for myself, it's that expensive. This is the gear that hasn't come down in price yet. It's a 300 frame a second camera connected to, via power over Ethernet, and you need a lot of them. So you see the rig on the bottom shot there. And it's looking down, it can do a similar thing with vision libraries. It doesn't necessarily need markers on the person, it can just look at things. There's a mob in Melbourne that use an earlier generation of this to do this kind of VR, basically play zombie games together. They use a coloured LED on the devices and on the person, and then use the cameras to dead reckon where they are. It's pretty nice, but you can scale VR into as big a space as you want. Now, the space of the consumer gear is about 4 metres by 4 metres. Limits the kind of worlds that you can walk through. In fact, it limits you to cockpit type computer games and simulations where you're sitting down and the world moves around you. Incredible for that. Or sort of fighting type simulations where the game comes to you, or video where you're stationary. And there is a quite interesting sim, it's not even a sim, it's there are cameras that record in 3D, and there's one which is a concert, and you're sitting, they put the camera next to Paul McCartney playing a quite significant gig, and you put it on and the sound is great and he's just there, and you look up and the audience is out there. It's a very strange experience. You kind of, without free roam, you're limited to those sorts of experiences that peg you in a place. Alright, so that's all the archaeology done. Nearly finished with the slides. Other things that are just coming out now, eye tracking. Now that looks very similar to all the headsets that are here, but you'll notice around the ocular lenses there's these little dashed they're laser encasements, and they will, I don't know how you feel about a bit of laser eye surgery, but that's an infrared laser or several infrared lasers that are picking exactly where your pupil is looking. Because once you've got the VR, one of the problems that's just emerged in the last couple of years is how do you interact with the world once you're in it? If you know where somebody's looking, one, there's apps now that train you in public speaking and analyse, using this, analyse where you're looking and tell you what you're doing wrong. I should take tips. But the really cool bit is if you're in the virtual world, the way that you might highlight something that you're interested in is just to look at it. You go, okay, I'm looking at that there. It'll highlight it for me. Yep, okay, and I blink and I've selected it. Because there are hand controllers which I haven't brought with me. They are still quite kludgy. The next step is using those forward-facing cameras in the head-mounted display to track your hands. That's been around for a little while. It's getting better, but it's still kludgy. You try to pick up something in a virtual world and the illusion evaporates very quickly because you're grabbing air. There's nothing there. Whereas with eye tracking, if the method of using it is you look at something, you interact with it at a distance. So you can keep the illusion of the VR for longer. And again, that's a HTC Vive Pro that's shipping those now. Cool, but expensive. And that's kind of where we are now. It's the second VR winter. Facebook purchased Oculus, the company that makes these, 3 years after they launched for $2 billion, which is just crazy money. And a lot of research and commercial money and venture money has gone into VR in the last 5 or 6 years. And it hasn't actually, one gamer in 50 probably buys a headset now. It's not hit the market penetration that anybody thought. It was way under that. And like what problems still have to be solved? Well, latency is still an issue. That 20 milliseconds, it's still hard to get to. Game engines are built like a pipeline. One thing happens, then another, then another, then another. It's quite hard to shrink it down so that input to action on the screen happens in under 22 milliseconds. That's still challenging. In-ear problems. That free roam is great if you can walk around, but that takes it out of somebody's home and becomes something that has to happen somewhere else. That's a really, really difficult challenge to fix, and it might be terminal for VR, and sort of it might always be a niche industry because of that. Just because, yep, cockpit simulators are great if you want to pretend that you're flying a Spitfire, but shoot 'em ups, not so good because they're all built to roam through the world, not have the world come to you. You've got to build a custom game for it, and it's a niche thing. Also, even the best rigs now, you do not want to wear for more than about 90 minutes. It gets a bit much. You get a bit of eye strain. Your brain starts to let go. Your loved ones start to feel that you're getting distant. And there are no. If you want to give somebody the sense that you're not interested, put one of those on while you're in the living room. And there are no killer apps yet. And one of them, my background or recent background was video conferencing, where you're taking people far apart and putting a screen between them. And I was doing that sort of before Skype with enterprise grade gear. This has the potential to do that, but not in the way that it works now. Because in the way it works now, it's video. You can see my face on a screen if I stand in front of the camera, which I'm doing now. And you can beam that somewhere else and I can interact. If I want to interact with you in that virtual meeting room, the camera has to reconstruct me as a digital avatar, because if you take a photo of me, I'm wearing a headset and it's not exactly expressive. The eye tracking is great. There are demonstrations that you stand in front of the camera, 3D models you, and then based on what it thinks your eyes are doing, it manipulates that 3D version of you. And in kind of video land, there's this idea of the uncanny valley, where something is virtual, it's kind of real, but it's not, and it's actually not very comfortable. And that kind of telepresence stuff at the moment, it's in that uncanny valley. Yes, you can do it, but you're interacting with a cartoon, and it's a cartoon that has somewhat familiar facial expressions. It's just bad. I try these things every kind of 3 months or so. I see what's come out, and there's lots of demos in this space. And it's always interesting for the goals that people set themselves and the absolute abject failures. Fantastic. But there's no killer apps for this thing. It's cool, but what do you do with it? The one thing that I think that it might be able to do really well is 3D modeling. So think about gaming industry, think about how they actually construct their 3D worlds. The tools now are just starting to get to the point, like you can build 3D world with a 3D tool. I use a tool called Blender. There are now plugins that you can wear the headset and interact with the model in front of you with your hands. Go, okay, I want to pull that out there, I want to pull this out here. That's the first thing that I tried that actually felt somewhat natural and like something that I would want to do. Beyond that, it's all quite interesting, it's diverting, it's quite gimmicky. Architectural walkthroughs are fantastic, but you know, how many times in your life do you need an architectural walkthrough? You know, I'm building an extension at the moment. Great, put the CAD plan in there. That's a lot of work to do something that I can do in my head. But if I was a modeler, if I was actually doing that work for real, being able to interact with the 3D object in 3D space, walk around it, move closer to it, it's a much better experience than just doing it in Blender on the desktop. And I suspect what I would want to do is get something to 60% of the way and then fine-tune it in VR and have a much better insight into it as a result. So that's, you know, that's been done, I think, as far as slide notes go. Don't have any more? No, I don't have any more. So that, I hope, gives you a bit of a very quick potted history of graphics and VR. It's a really good idea. It's actually been around as a fully formed idea for 40 years, but it's only now getting to the point where the hardware can halfway get to what you might want to do in it. But I suspect we're probably another... I doubt it'll ever be mainstream. I shouldn't say these things on the record, but I don't think it'll ever be mainstream. But if it will be, it's still 10 years away. There's still development that has to do.
Ian, what about the medical? Because I've seen a lot of the, you know, the practice surgery sort of stuff.
So telesurgery is a thing, and there are companies that make telesurgical devices. The devices that are mainstream at the moment aren't head-mounted displays. The surgeon will actually lean in, and it's very similar to the experience they have when they're looking down a microscope.
Yeah.
So yes, you can do it, but the ability to wave your hands about doesn't actually help with surgery. So the rigs that they have for telesurgery is a little bit like at the beginning of The Simpsons, where Homer's got his hands in the radio. It's that. So you need to very precisely track the hands. Yeah, that's exactly right. You need to precisely track the hands, and you need to bring them right into what they're doing, and still.
Yep.
Because that's actually very closely replicates what a surgeon does in real life. They're that far away from it, and they don't dance around it, so they don't actually need the head-mounted display. But in that space, yes, telesurgery is... The hardware is not the problem. So the hardware is now able to be sub-millimeter accurate, putting a scalpel. The problem is, 1, software, 2, trust. You have just put a million lines of code between the scalpel and the guy driving the scalpel.
Yeah.
And a network connection through Telstra. Now, if I'm in Antarctica, and it's the only possibility. So those scenarios at the moment, they will have nurses around them, and there's meant to be, in theory, lots of fail-safe. So if it gets a ridiculous stabbing motion put through it, it tries not to, doesn't believe it. It just says, no, I'm not moving at all. We don't use anything like that in Tasmania. It's interesting, but no. About as far as we go in Tassie's, things like they're now talking about broadcasting some of the surgeries to the students elsewhere in the state, which is a trivial problem compared to actual telesurgery. But yeah, the robots exist. But yeah, that you get into. I guess I've been in tech too long to trust it. I would be very, very cautious about being anywhere near one of those machines.
The limiting factor is probably the insurers who refuse to insure surgeons using it.
Earlier.
Or we will, that's 150% of the cost you want, so...
The difference, I mean, this is where you're into space where I actually know a little bit about what I'm talking about, way more than this. Health systems, for all of their goodness, are not built as safety critical systems. The computers that you're attached to can crash. The microcontrollers that will run the ICU will continue to keep your artificial lungs going indefinitely. But when you actually get into the quality of the applications, the quality of the code, it's not that high. It lags banking, it lags everything. Whereas if you look at aviation, you have safety critical. It's much harder to write code. You have multiple paths of redundancy. You have real-time operating systems. If you're going to build telesurgery, you're going to be serious about that. You actually have to do it as a safety critical engineering problem, not how would you describe the engineering? It's most of the stuff that we use in health. It's about the presentation of information. And you can get a lot of efficiencies in your hospital if you can present to the ward station everything that's happening in the ICU. Hugely important, but if it drops for 30 seconds, it doesn't matter because the device keeps going. Telesurgery, you need a level of redundancy that people that work in health coding just aren't, they just don't do. You need different sets of skills, and that's why the people that build those machines, companies like Siemens, that are big into industrial control, really, like there are areas in health that have very good quality code, things like linear accelerators that are used to treat cancers. You've got radiation beams that will cut flesh. You have to be careful how you move those magnets and how you do that calculation. They're very robust, incredibly robust, but the bread and butter stuff, not so much. And
when you sort of talk about like laser surgery or whatever, that's in the local environment. If you talk about remote surgery, and when you've got latency in the network, how would you cope with that?
This is where I think the goal of the IT industry the last 10 years is we wave our hand and we say AI and then don't explain. The way that you deal with latency, if you are doing something that's cutting or burning, you actually have to have a lot of smarts built into the local device. So you have to have a surgical plan. You have to also know, okay, we're going to cut from here to here, and the device then says, okay, I've got a 3D model of where I'm cutting from here to here. Latency doesn't matter, it's actually doing the cutting, you're not. The interface to the surgeon needs to feel like they're actually doing it, and that's where it gets a little bit difficult. But anything like that, it can't just be like a live remote control situation, because any latency is going to degrade how well that works. And again, it might mean that it's useful when you're talking remote areas, when you're talking Antarctica is a really good example, but in other scenarios, it's not really that practical. It doesn't save you that much. And the other thing is that the cost of those machines is you have to pay for, well, probably for the insurance as much as anything else. They're hugely expensive devices, and they're pretty basic. So they tend to be, at the moment, there isn't a general purpose surgical device. I didn't think I'd get onto this topic today, but they're built for, okay, this is a robot that assists in ophthalmology. Typically, where that stuff's going at the moment, from what I've read, is it can take clinicians out of a surgery. So you don't need 3 surgeons, you might be able to get by with 1 or 2. A little bit like a 747 doesn't need 2 pilots and an engineer now, just get by with 2 pilots. That's probably the interim step. I mean, the goal would be Star Trek, you go and it just does all the stuff, and it just uses a library of artificial intelligence to figure out what's wrong with you and then fix you, but it's a million miles away from where we sit at the moment.
Medical trichology.
Ian, you mentioned in a lot of your talk here, you were talking about, it sounded like you were saying that gaming and the consumer side of it seemed to be the push for critical mass and the acceptance of the technology and the advance of the technology. It seems to me that the application for this in like simulations for training and education, where resources for physical objects are very expensive, and you can simulate them in this and then have, I mean, maybe the technology makes it, to make it realistic, makes it just as expensive as like a real Formula One engine.
Yeah.
You can't have thousands of Formula One engines for people to try and virtually repair.
Again, as you can see, I had a lot of slides and I had to pull certain bits out. The military applications for simulation have been parallel to the development. So that, yes, they've been around for a while. The interesting thing that's happened is, particularly in the world of flight simulators and combat simulators, they were custom things all the way through until about between 15 and 10 years ago, depending on what type of simulator you're talking about. The sims that are used to train Navy SEALs are running the Unreal Engine. I know that because I spend time in the Unreal Engine, and when they're selling you stuff, they say, hey, look, at these are real world applications. You can train, it's built for shoot 'em ups, you can have real model shoot 'em ups. The game engines actually surpassed, both in lines of code and quality, what was being produced. And ditto with simulators. The engine behind Flight Sim X is what they use for train simulators within Australia. That's Flight Sim X derived. They sell it to you separately and they license it accordingly. But the code base that's generating the 3D and interacting with the virtual cockpits of whatever you're training in, that's very stock. And when I said you needed reusable software that solves the problem of 3D to make things like VR work, that's it. And the world has gone from having lots of very specialised, if you like, simulation engines or game engines to just a few. And as I say, there's 4 or 5 now. There'll probably only wind up being 2, and they will end up doing everything, which is astounding. And it becomes about what software you put on top of it. So if you want to be going down a professional road, all of that software has outputs to the real world. So I'll just move that so that the camera doesn't die. So if I'm plugging in, for example, a Stewart platform, which if you've ever seen a train simulator or a 747 simulator, a real one, it's sitting up on a platform with hydraulic actuators underneath it. All of that can be taken from, all of that orientation information can be taken from every mainstream game engine that's available here. So if you've got your coders, you don't have to sort the 3D problem out, you don't have to sort the physics problems, you just have to write the interface between whatever you've written, whatever you've modelled, and whatever you've built to help that simulation.
So the field that's being built, as in build it and they will come, is in the gaming industry.
It's surpassed it. So
Yeah.
there's always crossover. So if you're modelling something in a 3D world, if you're a 3D animator, for example, you can use a game engine to live view the latest Toy Story movie, but when it goes to be rendered, it goes to a render farm and it's a much slower process that gets a higher quality output. But at the end of the day, it's just a 3D representation of the world with textures laid over the top of it. The more of that you do, the better the quality can be, but the actual workflow is the same. So you can have crossover and you can move between industries. So now, back in the 90s, you had coders being level editors. They weren't. It wasn't a specialised thing. 3D modelers now, it's a profession, and it's actually more an artistic, creative profession than it is a technical one.
Going back to what you were saying earlier, I'm just wondering how close we are for the interior designer, say, to go into a room, take a mask on the face, look at the 4 walls of the room, take the registration off it, and then point with the finger to the artificial image and move things around the room and redesign the room and show it to somebody else on a screen without actually moving a piece of furniture.
So you're describing a very good end-to-end process. Technologically, you're there now. In terms of examples that I've actually seen, there was one that was used a Microsoft Kinect, which is quite special camera that can look back at you and figure out, okay, I'll basically model you in 3D in real time. And what it was used for was, in that case, was as a shopping aid. So okay, I want to try this top on, that top on, and it would just be it was just a mirror showing you you on a screen, but with wearing different tops. It's harder to do than you might think, and the problem is getting a very good 3D representation into the device quickly. That discipline's called photogrammetry, where you take lots of photos of something and then stack them together, figure out where the points of interest are, build the 3D model. That's not real time yet. So we're not quite there, but it's getting there. And in terms of the process of an interior designer, they routinely use CAD now, and they routinely generate 3D images to sell their designs before you commit to build. So that using the tools is not foreign at all to your serious designers, but doing it sort of a la carte while you're there, not there yet, but probably not more than 5 years if there's a market for it. As I say, the technology's there, it's if there's a market. And it's more a question of if there's a general purpose version of that same problem that'll actually have enough of the market to solve it, then you get these little offshoots of nice things.
I was just thinking with interior design at the moment, that they start off with a drawing that they do or compose,
Yeah.
and then move it around the screen to show things. With this idea, you'd actually be able to walk into a physical room, take a special camera with you if you like, do a 360 scan, plot everything, and then say, all right, I'm now going to move that couch from that wall to this wall, and I'm moving that picture down to here, and this is how it would look like. If you turn around here, this is how it's all going to move in relation.
Where those problems tend to fall over is issues of occlusion. So the couch is a really good example. So if I take a picture of this room now, or a series of pictures, even if I photograph it from every angle and every possible spot that I can get the camera, I can use software to generate an image of this room. It's how I modelled my truck. Sub-millimetre accurate, seriously. Sub-millimetre accuracy of model of a fire truck by taking lots of photos of it. Pure witchcraft. The problem becomes, if I move that couch, one thing the camera never saw was what was under that couch. What did the surface do? So what it gives you is a very good paper mache kind of view of the world that is a millimetre thick. And the second that, when you say, I want to move from here to here, it doesn't know that there's a floor underneath it. It has to extrapolate. And so it has to start to make assumptions. And that's where it gets quite challenging. Not impossible, but challenging. So you need to tell it a little bit about the physics of rooms. Okay, the floor, you need to identify the floor. It'll be the horizontal thing at the bottom of all of these images, and it will be continuous space.
So you've got to go back to building the floor and then put the furniture on it.
It all starts with a model, and part of this is there's a way of getting a model from the real world, which is what you're describing, and then there's a way of manually building that up and building the model from scratch. The virtual world in there, that's built from scratch. They tend to feel better when they're built from scratch. As soon as you go into something that's captured from the real world, like a Google Street View kind of thing, they feel a little bit weird. They feel a little bit low res. But those sorts of problems are actually solvable. But
Not yet.
well, to solve a problem, you need a market for solving it. You need, if it's got 100,000 hours of developer time to solve that particular problem, you have to justify. There has to be someone that's prepared to pay for 100,000 hours of work, or it needs to be a cool enough problem that your open source guys get interested in it. And in the case of Blender that I talked about, where you can do 3D modelling in VR, that's just being driven at the moment by guys that really want to do 3D modelling in VR. They're just doing it off their own bat and doing cool things. Whether it works or not, who knows, but they're prepared to do it and see, which is part of the fun of this stuff. Any other questions or anything? All right.
Can we just before we go into the demonstration, can we just show our appreciation of please?
We wish you a life.
This is interesting.
I know.
I felt I was listening to a professional presentation ready to go on ABC Radio or something.
Oh, well, thank you. I must say I should have been more across my notes than I was, but, you know, life goes on. Yeah, all right, so I'll try to wake some of these computers up. What we have discovered is that some of these demos don't actually like to stay running, because I only ever run it for about 5 minutes. Let's see. Every one of these computers has gone to sleep. Oh, no, we're good.
It should have been on the archaeology slide.
Oh, yeah, don't. Oh, you're kidding me.
Yeah.
I thought you were joking when you said updates, Ron. Go away forever.
Just have an update.
It wanted to, but I told it to go away. You will lose the little lost vision tracking. I think this is still. Oh, stability. Some of these demos actually they're not all executables that you download. You have to actually compile them, and the later. This was a demo that they wrote for this first Rift, and it worked quite well, but it was never it was built in a version of the game engine Unity about 7 or 8 years ago, and Unity stopped supporting most of it. So I was stuck on the new one with a headset that wouldn't talk to the old Unity and a game that wouldn't build in the new Unity. And that was my last weekend, was fighting with it. But it works, except the fires and some of the visual effects don't work quite as well on the newest Rift. Okay, how about it?
Have a look.
Oh, that's very nice.
We'll go and find a bucket.
I'm not that sick, am I?
Very impressive.
Well, I needed computers. Ron supplied the computers. I supplied the graphics cards, and then the power of the graphics. It was one of those problems. It seemed simple, and then it got more complicated. It's all right.
So just remind people the generations.
Okay, Generation 1, 2012. Generation 2, 2014. Neither of these were mass market. They were what's called development kits provided to game studios and the like, and interested hobbyists. And CV1, consumer version 1 at the end there, which was I think November, December 2016 is when it officially was released, but no one really saw them until about middle of the way through 2017, which is the best of them today. Cool.
Go for it.
You should go for it because a lot of setting up. I mean, come on.
Yeah.
Get started. I'll clean up the sick before we...
Who's going to get
Yeah.
Trick is to put the headset on. Rex, you can be my guinea pig. You can go
Yes.
first.
And I've got to use this in some way, haven't I?
Yeah, I'll just press the power button and it'll wake up. So grab the controller. You'll drive it. You only really need to worry about that thumbstick at the left-hand side.
Right. Then I can't see where my thumb is. Oh, right.
So you look around by looking around, and you drive it left and right by driving that guy left and right. Takes a little bit.
So this is the one with all the sensors and lights.
Right.
Yeah. So this is IR through here, and the IR on the back was.
Yes, all right. Still alive?
And there's traffic from that.
Yep. Some of these guys too. Any of them don't behave the way you expect them to behave.
Where's the moon?
Left a bit, Rex.
Left a bit, is it?
I would go for a run up the stairs and a look around, Rex, if you...
Yeah. Oh, you want me to go up the stairs and look around for the moon?
Set a challenge.
How if I can turn around with something else, do I?
Backwards a bit, left a bit. You're just being obstructed by the railing. Your other left. A bit more left.
Oh,
No idea.
You were running
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't quite know what's going on with...
The thing with this stuff is it's like
The old one.
The audience get to laugh at what we're doing. That's true. I don't want to laugh at someone drawing up on a
Out on the balcony, right?
This is the...
Yeah, jump.
good. The moon's not out.
Where's all your equipment?
Oh, right.
There is a simulation that's out, which is not VR, but is brilliant, speaking of moons, which is the moon landing.
Oh, okay.
So someone modelled
A few
it.
games that have played, he's got this one.
It's basically from separation from Gemini. No, it's separation from what's the command module called? Command module down the cluster. And you're in buzzers seat. And you try to throw them on, and it's all built back from the telemetry.
You turn too
of,
fast, it goes sideways, and that's all. That's about you reckon.
And
And after I sort of got the hang of it, started working out to go
through the
fast,
recreation of
eventually got around fast.
Either that or
enough, the
it's
thing actually.
what actually happened.
My wife jumps went out.
It's a passive simulation, so you get to see what's coming
The
up.
game for people who just lie there and do nothing. Not a great marketing gig.
Well, you're standing up. I'm standing up.
That is disturbing.
As soon as the thing went out, I'm like trying to balance it.
Going down the stairs.
This line, you went down the
No,
stairs.
I stopped.
You stopped.
I actually wanted to grab the rail, but it didn't work. I grabbed the rail normally now.
This is too
I'm old.
expensive.
Ian, there's a text box thing. How do you get rid of that?
Okay, so
Yeah.
I think there's a future date behind there somewhere.
and then
Like the feature bus extender, that's like,
I wanted to grab that rail.
Well, there certainly was going inside the computer, Ben.
think about the bandwidth running over that's how many PCI lanes? That's a lot of gigabits per second going over. That shit nasty looking piece of ribbon cable.
That doesn't work.
No, so that one's just it's just a
Just going
computer,
to
it's graphics card in it.
It's 2.4 gigahertz of gigabits per second per lane by 16 lanes.
That
That's
one
a,
there.
Yeah, but all the real, that's all the stuff coming in here.
yeah, but it's still serial data.
Because the further back you go,
Not much latency.
Yeah, well,
that is just a 970.
I can hear you. I can't see you.
the next thing this time works on widescreen.
I can't see you. It's going round and round.
Gaming elite.
Walk through network.
The balcony now.
Teleport from site to site.
So that moves.
Why is that thing looking red? Oh, it's got a problem.
That goes on this way. Over here.
Okay, that was the next
Yeah. I want to see.
It doesn't seem to be in focus. Is that as bad as
Oh, right, okay.
But the reason you have
To me, this one doesn't seem to be in focus. Still not good enough for telesurgery.
You grab there. Hang on.
Somewhere in the supply chain, someone would think they were cheap.
That one there.
I can hear you there. Yeah, okay.
I was in the
I can definitely feel it. I'm not sure what that is. The stairs are disturbing initially.
So that does that take
Now it's disturbing.
Yes, with the exception of that there, because it's so close, doesn't actually look like it's in focus. But as I look out to infinity, it's pretty tight.
I need glasses.
Well, I don't actually know. They came back
Yeah, so these nearsighted, far-sighted, there's actually
Whereas that one's seen car park. Oops, banged the wrong ballard.
they're not optically the same. They aren't optically the same. This one it would be throw your glasses on and then adjust the headset out. That guy. You've got enough room. You should find.
It's going any faster though.
I think you can run if you hold just right hand trigger, Justin.
Ah, okay. Oh, yeah, you're right.
Just
Oh, look at the birds.
just hold it on.
Was this control made what happened?
go kart.
Not on glasses are created equal to this. Even more.
Well, let's not worry. I'll believe it.
We're trying to build a 3D rig out of this, are
I'm listening to the interview with the creator right now.
You've got two controllers and you'll use both of them. Use both of these tools.
All right, so you need maybe it's only a touch on.
It will be one day. That's my big tank on the back full of beer, cold beer.
I'm looking for
Farmers price.
Hey, the fire's gone out.
That'll be great.
spend so much time.
So can you get a mobile visual license?
Really bad.
Well, the business model that we want to run is wholesale.
Although when you move forward,
Yeah.
we need a first person shooting each other.
And my vehicle,
Just think of all those days playing poorly. Take it back to
Yes, I can look around.
Thank you.